London, October 1978. At 1943 hours, Colonel Dmitri Volkov walks into the Reform Club's private card room, smiling at men who write laws and move markets. But he isn't here for cards. He's running the KGB's London network under diplomatic cover, and MI6 has been inside his world for 92 days. A steward tops up port, a MI6 camera catches one clean frame, and a single word, silver, travels down a radio line. If Volkov leaves tonight, British sources burn. If he doesn't, London risks a silent war. This is Operation Silver Steward. Dmitri Volkov was born in 1936, when Stalin's purges were rewriting Soviet society weekly. His father, a mid-level party official, survived by understanding one principle. Information flows upward, consequences flow down. Young Dmitri absorbed this lesson early. By age 23, he had joined the KGB's second chief directorate, where his first assignment taught him something the training manual never said. A suspected informant broke not during interrogation, but during tea, when Volkov mentioned the man's daughter's school performance. The informant confessed to protect what he loved. Volkov learned, information isn't taken by force. It's offered for love, pride, debt, or fear. That lesson made him perfect for London. He arrived in Britain in early 1977 as a Soviet trade attaché, which meant two things simultaneously: access and protection. Access to receptions, parliamentary functions, and West End social circles where policy was discussed before it became law. Protection because diplomatic status made him legally untouchable. Britain couldn't arrest him, couldn't charge him, couldn't even question him without triggering an international incident. The role gave him exactly what a skilled intelligence officer needs: proximity to targets and immunity from consequences. Volkov's defining capability was deceptively simple. He could map a person's private need in 10 minutes and turn it into leverage in 10 days. He didn't recruit in dark alleys or anonymous hotel rooms. He recruited in dining rooms, over brandy, in places where the silverware cost more than most Londoners earned monthly. Men lowered their guard because the environment signaled safety, tradition, respectability. What they failed to understand was that Volkov saw the environment itself as a weapon. The more secure they felt, the more they revealed. By mid-1978, MI6 assessed Volkov as running at least 6 active sources and developing 3 more. His network reached into the Foreign Office, defense contractors, and financial institutions with access to NATO intelligence sharing protocols. Associates described him as patient, never rushed. He could invest months in a relationship before making any request. When the request finally came, it felt reasonable, even trivial. A name here, a document there. By the time targets realized they'd crossed into compromise, extraction was impossible. Volkov owned them, completely. Intelligence services had tracked Volkov for 18 months. Standard surveillance protocols applied initially: follow his movements, log his contacts, build a network map. But the KGB's counter-surveillance training was excellent. Volkov varied routes, checked reflections, used public transport unpredictably. Direct observation burned through surveillance teams faster than they could be rotated. Electronic surveillance faced different obstacles. His official residence had diplomatic immunity. The clubs he frequented were private institutions that valued discretion over cooperation with government agencies. Placing technical devices meant either criminal trespass or recruiting club staff willing to risk career and reputation. By August 1978, MI6 concluded that Volkov represented a Category 1 threat, active compromise of classified intelligence likely within 6 months. The authorization to proceed with extraordinary measures came from Joint Intelligence Committee level. What made the authorization significant wasn't the permission to act. It was the permission to act outside normal legal and diplomatic constraints. Someone at the highest level had decided that Volkov's removal justified methods that couldn't appear in any official record. What conventional methods couldn't achieve was Volkov's psychological vulnerability. He was trained against surveillance, against technical penetration, against interrogation. He wasn't trained against the one thing that made him effective in London: his confidence in British social structures. Volkov believed that certain spaces, the clubs, the dining rooms, the protected enclaves of Mayfair and St. James's, operated above the dirty business of espionage. He believed the staff were furniture. He believed ritual guaranteed safety. That belief was about to be weaponized against him. MI6 called this the pattern of life dominance strategy. The logic was straightforward. Don't chase the man. Own the rooms he trusts. If you can't follow someone through the city, become part of the city they inhabit. If you can't bug their conversations, be present when they speak. If you can't arrest them legally, make their safest spaces your operational territory. This operation fit that doctrine perfectly because Volkov's effectiveness depended on the same elite environments that made him feel untouchable. The obstacles were significant. First, Britain's elite clubs represented sealed social worlds. Membership required sponsorship, wealth, and the right background. Security wasn't obvious. No metal detectors or ID checks. But social rejection functioned as a barrier more effective than physical security. Anyone who didn't belong was noticed immediately. Second, Volkov's diplomatic status created political insulation. Any operation against him that became public would force a choice between admitting extrajudicial action or accepting intelligence defeat. Third, one operational mistake, confrontation, a visible search, anything that looked like government interference, would turn this into a diplomatic crisis that benefited Moscow more than any intelligence Volkov could steal. Despite these challenges, planners identified an opportunity. Volkov followed patterns. Intelligence professionals are trained to vary routines, but Volkov had constructed a life in London that depended on predictability. The clubs expected members at certain times. Social obligations created schedules. His cover as a trade official meant documented meetings, logged appointments, known associates. He had built a network using British structures, which meant he had to operate within those structures. Every pattern was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Within 12 weeks, all elements would be in position. But first, the human access needed to be resolved. MI6 couldn't insert officers directly into these spaces. The solution required something more patient. Seed trusted personnel into the supporting infrastructure that made elite London function. The people Volkov never looked at directly. The ones who poured drinks and cleared plates and moved silently through restricted spaces because their invisibility was their job description. During the recruitment phase, the case officer designated Shepard experienced what handlers call legend drift, the psychological blurring when false identity feels more real than the original. For 6 weeks, Shepard worked as a catering supervisor, managing schedules and training staff at an agency that supplied personnel to 4 clubs across Mayfair. Every morning began with the same routine. Wake as Michael Ashford, former hospitality worker, recently relocated from Bristol, rebuilding after a divorce. The legend had documentation, tax records, employment history, even a flat lease. The problem was that Michael Ashford's problems started feeling more immediate than Shepard's actual life. The divorce felt real because maintaining the cover story meant inhabiting the emotional reality behind it. In the post-operation debrief, Psychological assessment noted sustained persona maintenance for extended periods, created dissociative markers in 7% of deep cover operatives. Shepard fell into that percentage. But the mission continued because the access was irreplaceable. Intercepted communications from September 12, 1978, reveal Volkov discussing his daughter's upcoming birthday with his wife in Moscow. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant. The conversation centered on gift selection and whether a doll collection from Harrods could be shipped via diplomatic pouch. Volkov mentioned missing the previous 3 birthdays due to assignment schedules. His daughter was turning 8. When the operation reached its conclusion, that doll collection was still in transit, logged in the Soviet embassy's shipping manifest, never delivered. The detail serves no operational purpose except to confirm that targets are rarely only targets. By October 18, 1978, the operation entered its execution phase. The trigger was specific. MI6 signals intelligence intercepted a fragment suggesting Volkov planned to activate a source with access to NATO communications protocols within 72 hours. The intercept wasn't complete. KGB tradecraft remained excellent. But the combination of keywords and timing created what analysts call a 90% probability window. The source in question was believed to be a British civil servant with authorization to access classified material from multiple Allied governments. If that source delivered, the intelligence loss wouldn't be measured in compromised operations. It would be measured in Allied trust destroyed and defensive protocols rebuilt from scratch across NATO. The window was 48 hours. The operational plan designated Volkov as Target Viking. The codename selection followed standard protocol: impersonal, unconnected to the Yaush, actual subject, chosen only for phonetic clarity during radio communications. 3 clubs formed the operational theater. Whites received the designation Ivory, Boodles became Hush, and the Athenaeum was logged as Brass in the case file. Each location required individual assessment, entry points mapped, staff rosters documented, sight lines analyzed, security procedures understood. The Reform Club, Volkov's most frequent destination, wasn't given a code name. In internal documentation, it appeared only as primary target location, suggesting a level of operational focus that made additional nomenclature unnecessary. The infrastructure build began 8 weeks before execution. Document preparation came first. A junior case officer under deep cover, designated Larch in operational records, required a complete employment history that would survive basic verification. The legend included national insurance numbers, tax documentation, and employment references from 3 previous catering positions. Each reference connected to an actual business. Each business cooperated with MI6 through existing liaison relationships. Each phone number led to someone who would confirm employment dates if contacted. The detail level wasn't paranoia, it was necessity. KGB counter-surveillance doctrine included background checks on anyone granted proximity to Soviet personnel. One inconsistency would trigger deeper investigation. Equipment selection prioritized concealment over capability. The camera chosen was Minox class, specifically a Minox C, manufactured 1969, small enough to fit inside a closed fist, capable of capturing 12 exposures on specialized film measuring 8 mm by 11 mm. The device wasn't cutting-edge technology. It was proven technology, which mattered more. Film development required specialized processing, arranged through technical services operating from a Vauxhall facility that officially didn't exist. The camera itself would be carried by an embedded asset, not large. Compartmentalization prevented any single individual from holding multiple operational elements, whose role was limited to one action: be in position at the designated time. Capture the required frame. Exit without deviation. Communication systems followed Cold War doctrine. Minimal chatter, maximum clarity. Radio communications used single-word triggers transmitted on prearranged frequencies. The primary trigger, silver, indicated execution authorization. Secondary triggers covered contingencies. Bronze meant abort. Copper meant compromise detected. Ivory meant surveillance presence confirmed. Each word was chosen for phonetic distinctiveness. Under stress, in poor signal conditions, silver couldn't be confused with anything else. The transmission protocol used burst transmission technology, messages compressed into 0.2-second pulses that made interception difficult and direction finding nearly impossible. Receiving stations operated from 2 locations: a signals van positioned on Piccadilly and a backup station in Knightsbridge. Neither location was closer than 800 meters to the target zone, maintaining standoff distance if compromise occurred. Escape routes received the same analytical rigor as approach paths. The primary asset needed 3 confirmed exits from the Reform Club that didn't require passing through main public areas. Architectural plans showed service corridors connecting the club to adjacent buildings. Remnants of Victorian construction, when connected basement systems, allowed deliveries and service movement between properties. One corridor led to a building on Carlton House Terrace. Another connected to service areas behind Pall Mall shops. A third reached a building scheduled for renovation, where MI6 technical teams had secured access through the construction contractor. Each route was walked, timed, and memorized. If compromise occurred, the asset had 45 seconds to select an exit and reach the first decision point. After 45 seconds, pursuit would make extraction impossible. The team structure followed strict compartmentalization principles. Surveillance specialists operated independently from execution assets, knowing target patterns but not operational details. Their function was maintaining pattern-of-life documentation. Volkov's movements logged to the minute, associates photographed and identified, behavioral patterns noted. The execution team knew operational requirements, but not the broader intelligence picture. Their function was precise. Be in position, execute assigned tasks, extract. Case officers managing each element knew their segment and one level up. Only 3 individuals held the complete operational picture, and 2 of them never entered the operational theater. This compartmentalization prevented any single compromise from revealing the full scope. The planning consumed 6 weeks. By October 12, surveillance had documented Volkov's behavioral baseline with sufficient confidence to predict his movements 3 days forward. Larch had established cover identity and secured position within the catering supply chain without triggering counterintelligence interest. The embedded asset with camera access had rehearsed the required action 63 times using a mock-up room built in a Vauxhall safe house. Equipment had been tested, communications protocols confirmed, extraction routes verified. The operation had 72 hours before the window closed and the suspected source activation occurred. October 18, 1978. At 1400 hours, final authorization came through. The signal was bureaucratic. A 2-word confirmation transmitted via secure line. But it represented something larger. Someone had decided that eliminating Volkov justified methods that existed in the space between intelligence work and criminal action. The authorization carried forward momentum. Within 8 hours, surveillance confirmed Volkov's planned attendance at the Reform Club that evening. The 40-minute pocket, the predictable window when Volkov would be stationary, relaxed, and surrounded by the privacy he trusted, would open at approximately 2000 hours. At 1630 hours, the surveillance team began final positioning. 4 vehicles operated in rotation. 2 switch cars that could trade positions without creating pattern recognition, and 2 observation vehicles positioned at fixed points covering taxi ranks and main approaches to Pall Mall. The team members carried minimal equipment: handheld radios, notepads, cameras with telephoto lenses. Nothing that would seem unusual if questioned. Each vehicle maintained communication discipline, transmitting only when necessary, using the one-word trigger system to avoid extended chatter that signals intelligence might intercept. At 1700 hours, Larch entered the Reform Club through the service entrance on Carlton House Terrace. The entrance wasn't hidden. Club staff used it dozens of times daily, but it was invisible to members, which made it operationally perfect. Larch's role that evening was logistics coordinator, managing supply delivery and staff scheduling. The position provided legitimate reason to be present throughout the building without triggering questions about why someone was moving between restricted areas. Crucially, it provided access to the private card room where Volkov would spend the critical 40 minutes. The room required specific setup: decanter placement, glass selection, lighting adjusted to member preferences. Staff would enter twice, once for initial preparation, once for service. The operation would use that second entry. At 1800 hours, the asset carrying the MI6 arrived separately. This individual wasn't part of regular club staff. The cover was simple: temporary hire filling a schedule gap, arranged through the same catering agency that employed Larch. The agency received last-minute requests constantly. Someone called in sick, someone didn't show, someone needed replacing. One additional person appearing for an evening shift created no anomaly. The asset's function was narrow. During the service entry, position near Volkov's table, identify his companion for the evening, capture one clear photograph showing both faces. The action would take approximately 3 seconds. The MI6 sat in a jacket pocket, ready for single-handed operation without removing it from concealment. At 18:15 hours, a suspected counter-surveillance presence appeared near the Pall Mall taxi ranks. Surveillance spotted a male, late 20s, Eastern European appearance, who had been present in the same area the previous 3 evenings Volkov visited the club. The individual's behavior pattern suggested training, positioned where he could observe approaches, never looking directly at surveillance vehicles, maintaining casual posture while watching everything. MI6 assessed this as probable KGB counter-surveillance, standard protocol for protecting a senior officer operating under diplomatic cover. The presence complicated extraction, but not execution. The operation would proceed. The surveillance team simply adjusted positions, creating wider standoff distance to avoid making the counter-surveillance element nervous. Over the next 90 minutes, final elements moved into position. The signals van on Piccadilly conducted communications check at 1900 hours. All receiving stations confirmed operational, all trigger words confirmed, all backup frequencies tested. The case officer managing execution sequence designated Shepard in operational records. Positioned in a Knightsbridge flat with direct line of sight to nothing, because presence in the operational theater would create unnecessary risk. Shepard's function was coordination, making real-time decisions if complications emerged, and maintaining the documentation trail that would allow reconstruction if everything went wrong. Every event from this point forward would be logged with timestamp precision. 1912 hours. Final communications check complete. The one-word trigger for escalation was confirmed across all stations: silver. The word would travel from the club interior to Larch, from Larch via concealed radio to the signals van, from the signals van to Shepard, from Shepard to authorization level. Once transmitted, the operation became irreversible. Everyone in the operational chain understood this. The word wouldn't be spoken unless all conditions were met. Volkov present, companion identified, photograph captured, window confirmed open. 1928 hours. The asset with camera access was in position inside the Reform Club. Protocol demanded no direct eye contact with Volkov. Familiarity draws attention, and attention creates memory. The goal was to be scenery. Present, functional, forgettable. The asset had rehearsed this. Enter the room, move to the designated station, perform the standard service routine, maintain peripheral awareness without direct observation. The MI6 remained in the jacket pocket, positioned for right-handed operation. The asset was left-handed, which meant the motion would feel slightly unnatural, which meant additional rehearsal had been necessary. 63 practice runs had created muscle memory sufficient that the action could be performed while maintaining conversation with another staff member. That level of naturalness was required because any hesitation would be visible. 1943 hours. Volkov entered the Reform Club through the main entrance on Pall Mall. Surveillance logged the exact time. He moved with the confidence of someone who belonged, nodding to two members by name. Both identified later as Foreign Office personnel, neither aware their colleague was a KGB officer. Volkov requested the private card. Room. Speaking to the club steward with the casual authority of someone who had made the same request dozens of times. The room was prepared. The routine was established. Everything appeared exactly as Volkov expected, which was the point. Operations like this succeed not by creating new realities, but by maintaining familiar ones while inserting invisible changes. 1951 hours. Inside the club, Volkov paused briefly in a corridor where staff moved silently between service areas and member spaces. The pause lasted approximately 8 seconds. Long enough for the companion he was meeting to arrive from a different entrance. The companion was a British civil servant, subsequently identified through photo analysis as having authorization access to classified NATO communications material. This was the source activation MI6 had intercepted fragments about. This was the threat that had triggered execution authorization. The asset with the MI6 was positioned 12 feet away, partially obscured by a doorway, when both men turned toward the private card room. The camera captured one frame, showing both faces clearly. The asset never broke stride, never adjusted position, never did anything that would indicate the moment was anything except routine. Total time from capture to secure storage. 6 seconds. 200 hours. Surveillance logged Volkov entering the private card room. The timing aligned exactly with pattern-of-life predictions. Volkov favored this specific window because dinner service hadn't begun, the room was private, and interruptions were minimal. The room itself reinforced his sense of security. Wood paneling, leather chairs, paintings of colonial campaigns, an environment that communicated British tradition and discretion. What Volkov didn't know was that the room's very privacy made it operationally useful. No windows overlooked the interior, no public spaces connected directly, and member protocol meant no one would enter uninvited. The isolation he valued became tactical advantage. 20:05 hours. Service began. The ritual mattered deeply, not for its own sake, but because ritual creates rhythm, and rhythm creates predictability. Pour the port, step back 3 paces, maintain silence unless addressed. Exit smoothly. The operation didn't fight the ritual. It used it. Larch entered first. The logistics coordinator checking that preparation met standards. This gave legitimate reason to observe the room layout, confirm both men were present, verify positioning. A prearranged signal, subtle, nonverbal, nothing that would register to anyone not watching specifically for it, confirmed the moment had arrived. The signal was simple. Larch adjusted the decanter position slightly while making eye contact with the asset. The adjustment served no functional purpose. It was the green light. 20:09 hours. The asset entered for service. The door opened smoothly. The hinges had been checked that afternoon to ensure no sound would draw attention. 2 glasses required filling. Standard port service, exact protocol followed 100 times weekly in this building. The asset moved to Volkov's side first. The guest's companion would be served second. Protocol demanded this, and poured with the precise motion that indicated professional training. Volkov never looked up. He was mid-sentence, discussing something about export protocols, his attention entirely on his companion. The asset stepped back, moved to the second position, poured the companion's glass, stepped back again. Total time in the room, 22 seconds. Nothing unusual occurred. Nothing remarkable happened. That was the success. What did happen, what the operation required, occurred in the invisible margins. While the asset was present, a technical element was introduced. The specific method isn't documented in any file that survived official review, but operational logic suggests several possibilities. A contact poison applied to the glass rim using a delivery mechanism hidden in the service cloth. An aerosol agent dispersed during the pouring motion, colorless and odorless, designed to absorb through skin contact. A contaminated element added to the port itself, not in the decanter which others might drink from, but in Volkov's specific glass during the pour, using a delivery method that required only momentary hand position adjustment. The common thread across all possibilities. Deniability through normality. Whatever happened left no immediate evidence and required no action that would be remembered as unusual. 2017 hours. Volkov laughed. Too loudly for the setting, a sign his guard had dropped completely. Outside the building, surveillance logged the exact time and noted his position through window sight lines. Seated, left side of the room, back against the wall. The positioning was tactical from Volkov's perspective. He could see the door. No one could approach from behind. The wall provided psychological security. From MI6's perspective, the positioning was irrelevant. The threat wasn't physical confrontation. The threat had already been delivered through a mechanism so mundane that Volkov would never identify the moment of compromise, even if he suspected compromise had occurred. 29 hours. Volkov stood. The conversation apparently concluded. The meeting had lasted 24 minutes, shorter than predicted, but within normal variation. He collected his coat from the steward, exchanged brief pleasantries about weather and traffic, and exited through the main entrance without checking the room behind him. This was the vulnerability MI6 had identified during pattern-of-life analysis. Volkov trusted the sanctity of the club more than his own operational paranoia. He performed counter-surveillance in the street, varied his routes, checked for followers. Inside the Reform Club, he believed he was beyond such concerns. That belief was strategically fatal. 41 hours. Volkov reached the taxi rank on Pall Mall. The city was ordinary around him, headlights reflecting off wet pavement, evening foot traffic, a driver who pulled up without knowing his passenger's real occupation. Surveillance logged him entering the taxi. The counter-surveillance element, the probable KGB watcher identified earlier, also noted the departure but showed no sign of concern. Everything appeared routine. The taxi pulled into traffic, heading south toward the Soviet embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens. Approximately 2100 hours. Timeline reconstruction becomes uncertain here because the next confirmed data point is the emergency call from the taxi driver. The sequence appears to be: Volkov slumped in the back seat without warning. No shout, no struggle, no visible distress. just sudden physical collapse. The driver, alarmed but not yet panicking, pulled to the curb and checked his passenger. Volkov was unconscious, but breathing. The driver radioed for medical assistance using the taxi company's dispatch system. Emergency services were contacted at 21:07 hours, according to ambulance service logs. By the time paramedics arrived, response time logged as 11 minutes. Volkov had stopped breathing. Resuscitation attempts continued for 18 minutes. The official time of death was recorded as 21:36 hours. The driver was questioned extensively. His statement never varied. The passenger seemed fine, then suddenly wasn't. No words, no indication of pain, just collapse. The passenger had seemed slightly warm, perhaps perspiring more than temperature would explain, but nothing that triggered alarm. The driver had no knowledge of his passenger's real identity. To him, this was simply a tragic medical emergency involving a middle-aged foreign diplomat. He was released without charges because no evidence suggested anything except natural causes. Meanwhile, at 21:40 hours, Larch exited the Reform Club through the service entrance on Carlton House Terrace. The evening shift was ending. Nothing remained in the club that could be traced to the operation. The decanter used in the private card room would be washed following standard procedures. Crystal glassware cleaned in high-temperature water with mild detergent, then polished and returned to storage. Any residual elements would be eliminated through normal cleaning protocols. The asset with the camera had departed separately at 20:20 hours, walked 6 blocks through Mayfair, entered a bookshop, exited through a rear entrance, and reached a safe flat in Knightsbridge by 2100 hours. The MI6 was delivered to technical services within 90 minutes. Film development began immediately. The photograph captured at 1951 hours provided clear identification of Volkov's companion. The evidence needed to justify defensive measures against the suspected. Source: by 2200 hours, Shepard had received confirmation through secure channels that Volkov was dead. The confirmation came not from MI6 sources. The operation maintained strict communication discipline, but from emergency services, radio traffic monitored as routine signals intelligence collection. The death initially appeared in police logs. Sudden medical emergency, foreign national, Kensington area. The identification came later, when Soviet embassy personnel arrived at the hospital and diplomatic complications began. The operational team never gathered in one location. Extraction occurred individually, on staggered timelines, using different routes. Larch returned to the cover identity's flat in Hammersmith, maintained routine for 72 hours, then reported schedule completion to the catering agency and requested transfer to a different client. The transfer was granted. Staff turnover in catering work was normal, and Larch disappeared from that identity. The asset with camera access followed similar protocol, worked the scheduled shift, departed normally, and vanished from the employment records through administrative adjustments that made it appear the individual had never been more than a paperwork error. The surveillance team dispersed immediately after Volkov's death was confirmed. Vehicles were returned to motor pool. Equipment was checked back into technical services. Documentation was filed under classification levels that would keep it sealed for 50 years minimum. What was left behind was a death that looked exactly like what it was designed to resemble. A middle-aged man with cardiovascular risk factors suffering sudden cardiac arrest. The autopsy, conducted under diplomatic protocol with Soviet embassy observers present, found no evidence of trauma, no indication of poisoning detectable through standard toxicology screening, no anomalies that suggested anything except natural death. The pathologist's report noted minor indicators consistent with stress and poor diet, conditions common in diplomatic personnel working long hours in foreign postings. The conclusion was medically sound and politically convenient. Death by natural causes. By 2300 hours on October 18, the Metropolitan Police understood a Soviet diplomat had died suddenly in central London. The initial investigation focused on standard questions: identity confirmation, notification of embassy, determination whether any circumstances suggested suspicious death. The embassy's response was immediate and coordinated. A senior diplomatic officer arrived at the hospital within 90 minutes, demanded full access to the body, and insisted on Soviet medical personnel observing any examination. British authorities complied, following diplomatic protocol established through decades of Cold War precedent. Every lead ended in medical documentation suggesting cardiovascular failure, suggesting a sophistication level that made investigation pointless without evidence to contradict natural causes. The Soviet Union issued no official statement beyond confirming Colonel Volkov had died while serving his country abroad. The lack of protest was itself informative. Moscow didn't accuse Britain of assassination because making that accusation would require explaining why they believed a senior KGB officer had been targeted, which would require acknowledging Volkov's real function in London, which would undermine the diplomatic cover that made operations like his possible. The silence from Moscow was transparent to those in intelligence communities on both sides. But transparency wasn't the point. The point was maintaining the fiction that allowed the intelligence war to continue without becoming open conflict. Britain's Foreign Office expressed condolences and cooperated fully with Soviet requests regarding body repatriation and diplomatic formalities. The cooperation was genuine and strategic, simultaneously. Genuine because diplomatic protocol demanded it. Strategic because cooperation reinforced the narrative that nothing suspicious had occurred. If Britain had killed Volkov through extraordinary means, surely British authorities would show some defensive posture, some resistance to Soviet observation. The absence of defensiveness became evidence supporting the natural death conclusion. The operation achieved its tactical objective. The source Volkov had been preparing to activate, the British civil servant with NATO communications access, was identified through the photograph captured at 1951 hours. Defensive measures were implemented. Security clearances were quietly revised, access patterns were adjusted, and the individual was transferred to a position with no classified material access. The transfer was handled bureaucratically. No accusations were made, no criminal charges were filed. The individual likely never understood why career advancement suddenly stalled. The intelligence gained from stopping that one source activation included preventing compromise of NATO's cipher protocols, communication security procedures, and potentially defensive strategies that relied on communication security remaining intact. The strategic cost was harder to calculate. Relations with the Soviet Union entered a period of increased tension, not publicly, but operationally. The KGB rezidentura in London tightened security protocols, began rotating personnel more frequently, and implemented counter-surveillance measures that suggested they understood Volkov's death wasn't natural, even if they couldn't prove it. The operational environment became more difficult for both sides. Trust between intelligence services, the minimal trust that allows even hostile services to operate under accepted rules, degraded. The line between intelligence work and assassination became harder to identify, which meant everyone operated with increased paranoia and decreased predictability. For the individuals involved in execution, the consequences were permanent psychological marks. Larch underwent psychiatric evaluation 6 months after the operation and was assessed as experiencing sustained dissociative symptoms related to extended deep cover maintenance. The file notes recommend limited future deployment in roles requiring legend maintenance exceeding 30 days. The asset who delivered the technical element, whose specific action remains undocumented, reportedly left intelligence work entirely within 18 months, requesting transfer to administrative functions that didn't require field operations. The request was granted. The organization needed experienced personnel more than it needed one more field asset, and retaining loyalty from someone who had crossed that particular line mattered. Britain's assessment was that stopping Volkov outweighed the costs, diplomatic tension, operational complications, and the moral questions inherent in using methods that existed outside legal frameworks. Whether this proved correct would become clear over the following decade, as Cold War intelligence operations became increasingly aggressive, and the restraints that had governed the conflict since 1945 gradually eroded. Operation Silver Steward became a template. If diplomatic immunity and legal constraints prevented addressing threats through conventional means, then unconventional means became necessary. The logic was pragmatic. The implications were corrosive. The paradox sits uncomfortably. Was Volkov, a hostile intelligence officer, actively undermining British security from behind diplomatic immunity, making his removal defensive necessity? Or did Britain use a cherished institution, the private club, the symbol of civilized society, as an execution ground, proving that power ultimately ignores the rules it claims to defend? Perspective A argues the former. Volkov was dismantling British intelligence networks, compromising classified information, and operating with legal immunity that made traditional law enforcement impossible. Every day he remained operational represented continued damage to national security. The methods used were extraordinary, but the threat justified extraordinary response. Allowing hostile intelligence officers to operate freely simply because they hold diplomatic credentials creates an asymmetric advantage that defenders cannot accept. Perspective B argues the latter. A government that kills foreign nationals on its own soil without trial, without charges, without even public acknowledgement, has abandoned the rule of law entirely. If Britain's values include due process and legal accountability, those values must apply even to enemies. Using methods indistinguishable from assassination while maintaining democratic rhetoric makes the democratic claims hollow. The fact that Volkov was operating illegally doesn't justify Britain operating illegally in response. The answer reveals more about your worldview than about Volkov. If you believe national security justifies extraordinary measures, the operation was successful defense. If you believe democratic governments must maintain moral authority through legal restraint, the operation was criminal abuse of power, dressed as intelligence work. What's your take on whether governments can justify assassination when legal tools are insufficient? The question isn't academic. Similar operations have occurred repeatedly across the Cold War and beyond, each time with similar justifications, each time with similar consequences. Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you reconsider where the line sits between defense and murder, hit that like button and share.